Stanford University.
Everyone, welcome to the Stanford Seminar on People, Computers, and Design. Today we're really fortunate to have the artist Jim Campbell here. I saw Jim speak at Berkeley about 7 or 8 years ago, and he both has these incredibly beautiful artworks that really stuck in my mind, and also he has a wonderful ability to conceptualize of the field of computer art, and it was one of those talks that stuck in my mind for many years. And then when Gail White came here to speak in the seminar about 6 months ago, I brought this up. I said, you know, I love a lot of Jim Campbell's work, and she says, well, you should invite Jim. And so, you know, that afternoon I invited Jim, and we're really lucky to be able to have him here this spring. Next week we're going to have Gary and Judy Olson from the University of Irvine. And if anybody would like to meet with them, they'll be around here for most of the day. All right, thanks.
That was nice and short. Thank you. It's exciting for me to be here. I mean, I looked at the string of people that have been here in the last many years, and it's kind of an honor to be part of that thread. But I'm also kind of excited to be here because I am an engineer. I've worked in Silicon Valley on and off since 1978, I think. But through the time since then, I've also been an artist, and I've talked about my work probably about 100 times, and it's the first time that I've ever had a completely non-art crowd in the audience. So I'm very excited about having a technology crowd and technology interested people. So I'm going to show if I could get the lights down, please. Thank you. I'm going to show pretty much the span of my art career that started in my mid-30s till now, and kind of show the progression that the work has taken over the last 20 years. And the format that I was thinking is that we'd have questions during, if that's okay, but then also questions after if you want to wait till after. So feel free to interrupt me while I'm showing and discussing the work. Could you turn the sound down a little bit? It's a little loud. This is actually a silent work, so don't go too high with it. I started doing electronic art in 1988, and I did a series of works that dealt with the theme of mental illness. This is probably the only work I've ever done that had a human-computer interface in some ways, which was a button. It's called shock treatment, and you would sit at a table and it would capture an image of your face when you sat down, and there was simply a button in front of you, and you would press the button, and using kind of computer memory as a very simple metaphor for human memory, it randomly erased this image of your face as you press the button. Excuse me. One of the things that I was interested in from the very beginning was creating sort of psychological environments using cameras and image processing to create mere feedback systems, like that first work that you saw and like this work coming up. My background in engineering was hardware, so pretty much everything you see that I'll be showing you for the next 45 minutes to an hour were hardware-based works. Even the ones that should have been done in software, I did them in hardware because I'm a hardware engineer, so that's kind of how I know how to work. This is a work called Hallucination, where I set up a mirror and created, it's probably the most complicated work I've done, even though it was kind of the first work I've ever done, technically complicated. Created a mirror where you would stand in front of this system and you would see yourself on fire, and kind of the room behind you would be normal. The work was a complete failure because the goal of the work was to really upset people at the time and make them think about what it might be like to be mentally ill. But of course, people mostly just saw their reflections and would do things like wave at the camera even though they were burning up. There is sound. Turn that sound up a little bit. Yeah.
Tails.
So this virtual woman in the space would come out and stand next to you. So you'd be looking
Heads.
at this reflection of yourself, and she'd walk up next to you, and she would do things that would also affect the environment.
Heads.
In this case, based on the outcome of her coin flip, the flames would either come on or go
Tails.
off using kind of a random number generator. She was on Laserdisc at the time, and the way it was all mixed together was using image processing chips. In this case, all discrete. There were no FPGAs or no microprocessors involved. One of the technique that I tried to use to get people to look beyond the kind of wave at the camera effect was to have freeze people's image when they weren't looking and then put it up. So instead of being able to get an immediate response, you would look at this kind of burning icon of yourself as you walked away, or
Tails.
possibly not walked away. Another technique that I tried, again, to make people upset at the time,
Tails.
which actually worked a lot better than the flame, was to just have people go away based on the
Heads.
coin flip. So the coin would be flipped, and depending on the outcome of the laser disc and the computer
Tails.
random number generator, you would come and go in the space. I had to kind of invent something that didn't exist at the time. It was what's now called a difference key, which is how I was able to figure out where people were in the space relative to anything else. And here you see how a couple people chose to interact with the virtual woman in the space. One of the hard things to deal with was how, whether this woman in the space, whether she was behind people or in front of people, because obviously she's just flat, and that was challenging. Another work that I did that kind of used computer memory in very simple ways to be analogous to human memory. In this case, this work would capture your image, put it on a still frame on the left side, and it would gradually propagate to the right as a series of dissolving still images, getting noisier and noisier as the image propagated to the right. But the work also had a computer with, I think at the time, a 10 megabyte hard drive that would store images based on the movement in the space. So as you were seeing kind of this cartoon strip being created of yourself, experiencing the work, you would also see images from the past locations of the work. So the work kind of was defined by its history. You'd see it now, and you'd see yourself, but you would also see the 13 locations or 14 locations that it's been to over the years that would slowly propagate by. And I haven't changed the hard drive on it, so it's still a 10 megabyte hard drive, which could only store 1,000 images. So the way that it deals with that is that it, based on exponential decay, it kind of has a much larger chance of erasing an older image with a newer image. So mostly you see images from the last 10 minutes or the last hour, and then every once in a while you'll see an image from 10 years ago, if you kind of experience the work in front of it. This work incorporated two video cameras, and I was interested in creating a mirror where your reflection in the mirror, you wouldn't have control of your body. I basically did that two ways. One was that with delay, with a 5-second delay, but also with staccato movement, so that as you were looking at yourself, your body would move at 1 second intervals, timed with the ticking of the clock of the pocket watch. So when you stood in front of it and you moved, your body would move differently than you were moving. So it was kind of disorienting, almost like when you hear your self-talking delayed. It kind of just makes you not talk because it's so confusing, because it kind of disrupts that feedback system that we're also used to in terms of how we move and how we think. One of the things that I always enjoy about the documentation, the hours and hours that I record, are how people try to figure the works out. In this case, sorry, I didn't say, the outer part of the watch is real time, and so it's kind of these two worlds that you're walking into between the real time world and then the 5-second delayed staccato world. This next work is a public artwork that I did in Phoenix, Arizona, where the basketball team, the Suns, played in this kind of tacky food court. And I took the columns in the space that were already there, concrete columns, and I enclosed them with video monitors and brought in images from southern Italy and Greece of columns from coliseums and arenas there, kind of to put in this, as I said, Taco Bell food court. But I also had cameras in the each of the columns so that as people walk by, their image would be picked up. I used a different kind of keyer here. It was more of a movement-based keyer, again, that I kind of had to invent myself. Otherwise, the images would have been of the McDonald's that the camera was pointed at, and I was more interested in the people. The way that I kind of thought about the work was that it was kind of like a wind sculpture where the people going by were the wind, so they were part of it whether they kind of reacted to it or not. And the biggest challenge for this was 1992, was how to create a work that didn't feel like it was a rerun. I mean, it was a video work, 1992. I wasn't going to throw a videotape in there and have it kind of loop over and over again. So the way that I dealt with that was two different ways. One was the layering that you're seeing happening from a database of 500 images was real time. So there was essentially an infinite number of possibilities of layering 3 or 4 images on top of each other. It would always be a different 3 or 4 images combined together. But the second thing that I did is the work functioned as a clock and a calendar. So different times of the day and different times of the year, different images would come up. As I said, that was probably the most challenging part of this work, was how to really have it feel like, not that it was a different work every time that you saw it, but also not that it was doing exactly the same thing. So that would be incredibly boring. I also had a camera inside the bowl pointing at the basketball game, and I would kind of pull that image out and integrate it into the image processing. Until they made me take that out because it was showing the team rehearsing to the other team when they weren't supposed to be seeing them, so they made me take the camera out of the bowl. At this point, after doing interactive work for kind of 6 or 7 years, I kind of saw this model that was happening that was pretty typical both of my work and work that was kind of in the field of interactive artwork, and that was to give people what they wanted. They would walk up to something and something would turn on based on them getting closer and closer. So I chose to do 2 works dedicated to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle that I kind of call anti-interactive works. Very simple. You have your body controlled how foggy this cube became. So the closer you walked towards this cube with this figurine, the Buddha inside, the more it would fog up in a proportional way. But it was lit from the inside, the Buddha. So as it disappeared from your being able to see it, instead of seeing the statue, you would see the shadow of the statue as kind of projected onto this magic glass, as I call it. You can see it. For the first installation, I actually showed the camera on the ceiling that was giving me the information about where people were in the space relative. So that's what you're seeing in the background is the relationship between the figure, the people and the cube. The Buddha was sitting on text which you could never read because by the time you were close enough to read it, it was too foggy to read. One of the things that I kind of learned with this work and spent a lot of time on and the next work was for these interfaces, it's very important to have them not be, how can I put it, beatable, meaning that didn't matter how you approach that. You could kind of crawl up to it or you could kind of shimmy yourself up next to the wall. It would still know you were there. One of the reasons for that I have found in kind of doing this kind of artwork, or at least in museums, is that once people feel like they've figured it out, they get bored. So if I can make them kind of get beyond that notion of the, if you want to call it a trick, the trick, then they'll maybe pay more attention to it. In this case, there are these two levers projected onto a life-size bed of salt, so a pedestal in the shape of a bed. And the closer, it's at the end of a 60-foot hallway, and the closer you walk to this pedestal, the more it zooms in to the point of abstraction. So even more kind of voyeuristic than the Buddha piece, this one also dedicated to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, kind of a literalization of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, in that the more you try to observe this, the more you change it. In this, up until this point, this work was, at the time anyway, pivotal for me in that up until this point I used a lot of random number generation in my work, as I think did probably all artists of the time working with computers and trying to make something that you were doing seem more intelligent than it really was. Because if you gave it random processes or random numbers, then it would be unpredictable, and that meant that it kind of had its own. So for this work, I didn't want to do that. So as you approach this image, these two figures, it actually zooms in to the point, to the left-right part of the figures that you walk towards. So for example, if you walk towards their heads, it will zoom into their heads. If you walk towards their feet, it will zoom into their feet. But no one ever figured that out, I don't think anyway. But yet it's not doing a random process. It's actually zooming in to the points of the image for a reason, and that reason has meaning. And that was kind of an important point for me to kind of leave, at least for a while, the notion of randomness behind, to try to give more meaning, subliminal almost in this case. The figures were, the salt on the bed in this case was kind of rippled, so the figures that you saw was kind of like almost like a shadow of a bird on a beach, kind of 2.5 dimensional as when you look closely at it.
Did the observers have a chance to play with the salt, reshape it?
Mostly they put, I remember one in particular that said, "This piece sucks," and it was kind of just text in the salt. So they did do that, though it wasn't part of it. So if those last two works were anti-interactive works, I did a series of works, this being one of, that I kind of at this point called dead interactive works, because after working with sensors and recording and computer technology, those were kind of the tools that I knew. And so I chose to do a series of works that used those same tools, but the end result was not an interactive thing. They all have the same structure of a aluminum box containing an electronic memory of something. Oops, sorry. And then a representation of that memory kind of connected by wires above the box. And I was very interested at the time in just one analogy between computer memory and human memory, kind of a complicated one. But the notion of hiddenness, that you have memories or ideas in your head, and there's no way of expressing them. I mean, you can perfectly. You can try, you can draw a picture of them or you can talk about them, but they're still in your head and there's no perfect representation of them. So I was using computer memory, the meta-ness of kind of computer memory in the same way. The work on the left is called Photo of My Mother, and I recorded myself breathing. I used an airflow device to record my breath coming and going, kind of volume almost. And so her image is modulated by this 1 hour recording of my breathing.
Is that liquid crystal glass?
That's exactly what it is, yeah. Same with the Buddha piece that I showed earlier, if you were here for that. And this work's called Portrait of My Father, and it's same thing, but it's a modulated, it's a recording of my heartbeat.
Is the audio available?
No. It was really, one of the things that was very important for these works also, other than that notion of hiddenness, was that I feel like we're so hit over the head that our memories are kind of a series of photographs and sound bites. So I specifically chose all of the things that I have, the 13 or 14 works that I did, none of them were based on sounds or images. So in other words, I didn't use a microphone to do that. I used a EKG machine, and I didn't use a microphone for the breath either. I used a flow pressure device to measure the... So I wanted to get away from that basically cliche notion that a memory is nothing more than, memories are nothing more than pictures or sounds. I-N-T-H-E. Pardon me?
I didn't see much text at all in the presentation.
There's two pieces of text when they're showed. One is the contents of the box, the coffin, and the title of the work, and that defines the work. So for example, photo of my mother, and then it says my breath with a kind of a time period.
What other sensors did you try? You said you did 13 or 14 of these?
I'm showing a few more.
Great.
Accelerometer, for example, I put on my foot. I think I took that piece out. So for this work, I took the ASCII version of the Bible, and that's the memory, and then I recorded me saying the 26 letters of the alphabet. So you're hearing me say the Bible, the whole Bible, one letter at a time. It takes 36 days, 24 hours a day to go through it. And you're probably the only crowd that I've ever shown this to that aren't sitting there, well, you didn't read the Bible for 36 days, 24 hours a day, did you? Because usually that's what they think. This work, same concept, but Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, and then I typed the 26 keys of a typewriter and use that as the vocabulary, if you will, for the speech to be typed out kind of over and over and over again. Work on the left is called Cyclical Meter-Based Time, and I recorded a woman breathing for an hour. So I'm using the clock kind of as a different kind of meter than the way it's normally used, which is counting the cycles coming from the wall in this case because it's an old clock, and you'll notice the continuous movement of the old clock, which I use for more of a continuous process like breathing. And the next work is called Cyclical Counter-Based Time, and it's a more contemporary clock that has the discrete 1 second movements, and it's the same woman blinking for a 1 hour period, so it's actually just counting her blinks. And for that I did use video, but I actually kind of extrapolated the movement from the video. And for this last work I'm showing, it's I recorded the power line fluctuations in the wall, and I amplified that process for an 8 hour period. So, and it was actually during the day that there was an execution in Texas. So I took this anonymous photograph of an electrocution, and the image becomes modulated by the wall fluctuations from that day. And I guess I left this work in it. For this work I wore an accelerometer on my foot and walked on the beach for 45 minutes. So you're kind of and then modulated this image of sand using the liquid crystal display And so you're seeing kind of a representation, if you will, of what my foot was maybe feeling walking in the sand. Yeah, sorry. That was probably the easiest one. I just stuck basically a meter that I built that just recorded the. If you can just do that in the wall, and you'll get fluctuations in the voltage. Quite a few fluctuations, actually.
That's from the gallery, not from the physical.
Oh, I'm sorry. None of these works were live. I did that over an 8-hour period in my house, actually, and then put that in memory. All these works are about capturing these events and then putting them in the memory. Does that answer your question? In 1996, I was asked to give a lecture at MoMA in New York, and it was only maybe about the second or third lecture I'd ever given, so I was really nervous. So I spent about 6 months thinking about it instead of now, where I maybe spend about a day or so thinking about it. And what I did was I kind of came up with, I looked at the field of my field, if probably too big a word for what it is that I do, but interactive art, computer-based artwork. And one of the things I noticed was this, I'll play this. This is what I call a formula for computer art, was how many kind of what I now call one-liners, these very simple computer-based artwork where you doesn't even really use the computers, essentially. You have a process, and you basically have a straight line through to a representation, kind of a mapping of that process. And so I kind of came up with a formula for about 50% of the computer art that was being done at the time, including my own, which was kind of the beginning of me not wanting to do computer art anymore, because if you can come up with a formula for what you do, it's probably not very interesting. And it's amazing, this is kind of a more contemporary version of what I did then, but it's amazing how many artworks just went by you that I've actually seen over the years. But it really did actually start to kind of turn me off from doing the kind of one-liners, this being a perfect example. This was the work that I did in New York, inside the anchorage of the Brooklyn Bridge. It's this incredible space, and all you saw in the space when you walked in was this candle, but you heard this incredibly loud wind sound. And if you looked, hopefully closely, probably only about 30% of the people noticed, the wind sound was being created by the minor fluctuations of the candle. I had a hidden camera that was measuring the movement of the candle and creating a very big storm based on the really minor fluctuations, because there was no wind, or very little wind in the space. So if you think about the diagram that just went by before this, it's kind of again, a straight across thing. It's flickering and then wind on the other side. This was actually the second version of the work. The first version that I did actually had a giant light in a slight other space. So I was flickering a room of this size based on a little candle. And I did end up liking this work infinitely better. And somehow the translation of the senses using the movement to generate a sound worked a lot better than the light generating the light. I started getting interested in, I guess it was the beginning of an obsession with the pixel. This was really the first work. It consisted of these two color fields, fairly dynamic color fields, in this case in this hallway. And that's all you saw, basically, these two big 4-foot changing lights kind of in the walls of this hallway, changing fairly quickly. The installation was set up so you could walk behind into this little closet area, the other side of those color fields where they were being generated. And there was nothing in that room other than the projectors creating those color fields, and then directly below each projector was a LCD screen with a static image, or almost static image of a single pixel slowly moving across. And so, hopefully at that point you realize when you're in the space that this giant color field behind you is essentially a magnification of this pixel as it's gradually scanning the image. And again, probably maybe even less on this one, maybe 20% of the people figured that out. The goal of the work was, from kind of a, I don't know, when I was thinking about doing it, the thought was that having this light kind of shroud you as you were looking at the pixel, it would kind of, almost in a virtual reality way, make you feel like you were that pixel moving across as this light was enveloping you. Didn't work in that regard. I think it worked maybe on a more conceptual level. This is a work that I took the same idea, created an interactive work with it. So there's this image in this pedestal projected from below, and you put your hand on the image, and the image fades away and fades to a single color based on where your hand is. So just like the previous work where you have this scanning pixel defining the color, in this case you're defining it. But back to kind of Heisenberg notions influencing my work, you can't see the image anymore that you're exploring because it goes away. So you're exploring this image that was there, essentially. So you're simply magnifying the pixel that in this case is the person's middle finger. So wherever they move their finger, in this case it's the woman's mouth as she's talking, so you're kind of feeling that one part of the image just in the movement, the rhythm of the image. The sound for this work was not synchronized in terms of its audibility, being able to hear it, so that when the image faded away and you could no longer see it as you were exploring it, you could hear the sound. So that would give you cues as to what the image was doing since you could no longer see it. The one interesting thing about this work, I think, for me was that it was an interface that didn't have any pressure that it was goal-oriented. I mean, it was really about exploring, and most of the people who interacted with it weren't trying to get somewhere. It was really more about this playfulness. For me as an artist, the work was not successful in that it had half a page of instructions at the doorway, and there's nothing more I hate than an artwork that has a half a page of instructions to know how to interact with it or deal with it. This was a work that I've only shown once because it's the most boring work on the planet, but it kind of changed my life, so it was just a personal kind of revelation. Now it's kind of obvious, but at the time it wasn't. I did it shortly after I got my first 24-bit computer card. Essentially the first time I saw a real image, what I would call a real image, I guess, on a computer screen. And I woke up sometime in the first week of having that card, literally in a cold sweat. I have a mathematics background other than engineering. In the realization that there's only, even though this image was real and incredible, I remember it was even an image of a leaf, there's only a finite number of images possible on this new screen, on my new palette. It's finite. And of course that made me think, and so this work generates all possible images. Any image you can ever think of will eventually show up on this screen. An exact picture of your death, your birth, it will eventually show up on this screen. And so that kind of freaked me out at the time, and my background was photography and film from the art side before I started doing this kind of work. And not a kind of thought you would ever have with photography and film unless maybe you were a physicist, that there's only a finite possible number of images. But once you move to the digital realm, it becomes very finite. Very definably finite, I should say. And that started to make me think about how to bring non-finite kind of continuous things into my work. And in particular, using this thing called a Reconstruction filter. This is kind of a diagram of how information gets digitized into a computer and out of a computer. And one of the things I was interested in was images, what's lost in that process. And again, people don't know what I'm saying when I say this in art land, but now that I'm in computer land, we all know that there's no such thing as a digital image, that there are only images that were digital. And in this case, I'm showing two representations of the same data of an image. So it's the same digital file, if you will, same data, but two different representations. And you could ask the question, which one is more accurate? And I can answer it, but I won't. So that starting to think about kind of getting away from the digital, I started a series of works that I've continued to this day, 7 or 8 years ago, maybe 9 years ago now, where I created display devices to show images at their kind of borderline of perceptibility. In this case, it's an 800 pixel image of a figure running, and I'm kind of demonstrating a filter that I put in front of the screen that eliminates the digital structure of the image by kind of diffusing out the pixels. One of the things that I never actually understood when I looked at that Bell Labs image of Abraham Lincoln when I first saw it was that the pixels, when you see pixels in an image like that, they actually get in the way of your brain trying to decipher what you're looking at. It's essentially noise. The visibility of a digital structure in an image is noise to your brain in trying to see what the image is. In this case, we're looking at a boxing match. And another thing that I found, which in retrospect is completely obvious, but is that when I started using color to define these images at very low resolution, this is only 88 pixels. That when I started to use color, I needed a lot fewer pixels to exist right on that edge because each pixel had more information. It kind of had 3 degrees of information, red, green, and blue in this case. So the typical lowest point that I use for a normal black and white image is about 192 pixels. But in this case, it's less than half of that to define this image. One of the things about these low resolution works is they're very related to viewing distance. For example, this image on the screen, believe it or not, is extremely clear to me, but I assume that it's very abstract to you. But if you saw that from a block away, it wouldn't be abstract. You would be able to see the boxing match. And here again, I remove the physical reconstruction filter in this case, and it's even more abstract, even more kind of hard to perceive. Again, because the little blinking lights, your brain's trying to decipher those as much as it's trying to decipher an image. So playing with that notion of the filtering, the reconstructing of an image, this work is again an 800 pixel work that has a piece of diffusing plexiglass in front of it at an angle. So the figures, the cars in this work are going back and forth, and I can't lie and say between a digital and an analog like I normally do when I give my talk, but in this case from a continuous to a discrete representation of these figures, kind of in this gradual way, because the further away the plexiglass is from the image, the more it diffuses the image. I don't usually lie. I usually tell people both things. This work kind of combines two mediums. I took a photograph of the New York Public Library and made a photogravure print of that image on rice paper. And I put one of the low resolution panels behind it, and I shot the video of the figures from exactly the same perspective that I shot the library with a high resolution still camera. So it's a superimposition of the low resolution movement with the high resolution still image. But also kind of a combining of this old medium with a new medium. Yeah.
So you haven't made mention yet, maybe you will, that you're still using very high temporal resolution for all these videos. I mean, it's a high frame rate. And I would guess that has a lot to do with our bringing the ability to make sense of what's going on as well.
Man, I have to skip the next 10 minutes. Yes, exactly. And that's probably after this piece I'll talk about time. And one of the things that I wanted to do, I'll show this briefly. This work is extreme in terms of the information that I'm giving to the viewers. It's just a perimeter of an image. So it's 50 pixels defining the edge of the image. And you wouldn't know what you're looking at unless you looked at the title of the work. Maybe the fire. It's called A Fire, a Freeway, and a Walk. A freeway at night is what it is. And so given the context of the title near the work, then you can actually stand back and say, yeah, I see that. But even more than saying I see that, I think it's felt, and I think that's important, and that's led me to a lot of other work. The notion that some small clues or cues can actually kind of send you in a different direction in a meaningful way. This is a series of works that I did that use home movies as the footage, and instead of the LEDs facing you or a screen in between you and the LEDs, these LEDs are facing, and they're in a curtain, and they're facing the wall. So this image is created by this curtain of LEDs, but it's also in the way of seeing it. So again, it goes back to kind of my obsession, or it's not even something consciously thought about, but the Heisenberg notion that hopefully there are no physicists in the audience, that the display device is in the way of the display. Yeah. And I was shocked. I did two of these. This first one has a 3-inch pitch between the pixels, and the second one had a 6-inch, and I put them both in the same art show. And I thought for sure that you wouldn't be able to see this image, that taking out that much information was going to be too much, and that you wouldn't be able to comprehend the image. I was completely shocked that you could, to the point of 2 days before the show, I did a third work that I don't show here, where I actually, same size squares, 1.25 inch black squares, but I only put 1/8 of an inch between each black square. So the whole thing was this big, and all you were seeing were these lines. And that was also actually very clear if you were far enough away. So this is the 6-inch pitch one. And the gallery was too small to see this work. It was about a 30-foot gallery and a 15-foot image, and you really needed to be about 40 or 50 feet away. These are the kinds of things that were hard to pre-guess ahead of time. Fast forward past this one. Let's see, 10 more minutes. Yeah.
One question is, to what extent is that physical realization of the board of LEDs important? Also, imagine just taking a larger LCD screen, but only lighting up every nth little rectangle of pixels and leaving the others dark.
Being an engineer and thinking about problems, I certainly thought of that at the beginning when I started doing these works. And I can't answer the question other than saying it's completely different, but I can't tell you why. It's completely important that that you actually see the device, that you feel it. And it's this totally thing I don't understand. There's been a few times when I've shown these works in situations where there's a screen in front of them in a very dark room at the end of a hallway where you actually have no idea of the apparatus of the work, and it's a completely different work, frankly, very boring work, without being able to kind of see the structure as part of it. But I don't mean intellectually boring. That's what's kind of interesting about it. It just becomes a different thing the way your brain takes it in. And I wish I knew the answer, but I don't. But it is very important. And I'm glad I didn't listen to my second question of, well, maybe I should just do this with video, because it would have lasted about a week and I would have been bored. Yeah, exactly. This was a series of works that I did thinking about movement. Actually, let me back up a minute here. So I started to photograph these works for documentation. This is a figure running again. And one of the things I realized was that, or I saw, was 98 out of 100 pictures that I took, it was just this black blob on the screen. And so it kind of clued me in pretty quickly that the movement in these very low resolution images was actually the most important thing about your brain comprehending what it is that you're looking at. Way more important than, you can't really separate them out, but way more important than this kind of individual series of still frames. And I'm showing that here by this figure walking that just completely just turns into a black blob. So that led to this series of works, which motion studies of disabled people walking. I did worked with 6 different people. And for me, it was really the first time that the medium and the content came together, because the medium inherently gets rid of the hairstyle of the people and the gender of the people and the clothes they have on. So it's really a distillation, using the medium, which it inherently does, to distill the movement from the images of these people walking. It's really just their gait that you get from the works. And in my kind of way of doing these continuous transitional things, if you take the argument and you believe it that when these things are still, they're abstract, and when they're moving, they're not. I did this work of these ocean waves, which over a 10-minute period slows down and stops gradually. So it starts out as completely representational and ends up as completely abstract just by slowing down. And a video wouldn't do that. A video of ocean waves would be a video of ocean waves, and it would end up as a photo of ocean waves. But because the movement is the most important thing, as the student pointed out, it took me 3 years of working with this technology for me to figure it out. But then what happens when you actually slow it down gradually? And it happens. I've only watched it actually go through its whole process once, but it's kind of disorienting, because you actually remember, in that case, you actually remember the movement happening also. Interestingly, so at this resolution, these works have something in common with sound, or at least recordings of sound. If you take sound and you slow it down, it's abstract. It heads towards abstraction, because sound is defined by movement, as these low resolution works are also. This work is called Self-Portrait of Paul D. Marinus, who's a professor here in the art department, who's inspired my work. And I recorded his voice going as low as he could go in tone to as high as he could go in tone, and took a low resolution image of him also. And the way the work functions is in the lower box on the left is the image, stored the image of Paul, only 192 pixels. In the box above it are a series of 32 tones of Paul's voice, again going from as low as he could go to as high as he could go. So the image plays the sound to generate his image into the room through a speaker. Low tones being black pixels and high tones being white pixels. And then there's a microphone 4 feet away to capture this sequence of tones and recreate that image with obviously room noise and any kind of sound activity in the space interfering with that process and maybe putting a big scar on Paul's face as it's trying to be generated. Oop. And this work more than any work I've done. I don't think Paul's here. I didn't see him. Drove the gallery nuts where they showed it for 30 days because living with that kind of had to be pretty loud because of the technology I was using. I started looking at ways to kind of continue a progression, and this is a work called Reconstruction that starts to bring this image out into three-dimensional land. It's a 2.5-inch thick piece of resin with particles inside it, such that it's kind of like a flashlight in a smoke-filled room. You see the image as it's being created. You see the pixels spreading out. That was kind of the beginning of pulling the image off the wall, if you will. This was the next version of that. It's a public artwork in Colorado where it's a 10 by 13 foot image on the side of a building, and they wanted me to deal with this whole city block of these figures walking. So what I did is I pulled out pixels from the image and spread them across the city block, connected in real time. So including a cluster of 16 right in front, which were right from the middle of the image. So it was kind of a way, or it is kind of a way of extracting information from the image that isn't really visual. It really becomes more about rhythm. So that is directly tied in a one-to-one way with 16 pixels above in the image that's recognizable. You obviously don't see an image in the 16 columns there, or in this case the 11 columns that span the 200 feet across the block. But if you have the reference of the waves behind it, or even in your head, then I would say, to use a word that I don't use very much with art or science, but you feel it. So you feel the rhythm of the image, even though you can't say that you see it. That work only had a single light underneath each of the, this works at UCSF in San Francisco. The previous work had a single light underneath each of those cubes. This work, I used the same resolution in the cubes that I did in the structure, and so there are 25 pixels behind each of those glass bricks in that large structure, which 6 feet square. So the cubes that are spread around the garden, which are again connected to this wall in real time, now have slight movement within them because there are actually 25 pixels in the cube. So you can actually feel something moving across these cubes. This is up, hopefully working.
Does it say that forever, or was it just for like a short period?
This one's there, forever. Yeah, this was a commission. The other one also.
You get an SMS when it's not working?
No, that's my next project at the airport. slightly different direction, taking, on that same theme of extracting information out of an image and mapping it kind of into, in this case, into the room or into the space. So in this case, I took, divided this cast glass chair that took a couple years to make into 17 pixels. Each structure of the chair is essentially mapped to a different pixel on the screen. So when something happens on the image behind it, again, you feel whatever's happening on the image behind it happen across the chair. Wrong question. Took 2 years to make, and somebody sat in it a month during the first show of it and broke it, shattered it to pieces. Gallery didn't want to put a sign up right near the work. So, for example, a figure would walk across this low-resolution panel, and it would almost be like a shadow would be walking across the chair. And I'm working on a whole room that way, so that an image is kind of mapped to a whole room. So this is 200 pixels defining a, almost done here. 200 pixels defining an image, again with a thing in front of it, of this running figure. This is 48, where if I tell you it's a running figure, maybe you'll believe me, kind of thing. Probably not, which is why I've used 192 for most of these. And then the next thing, what all of us electronic artists have tried at one point or another, this is 1 pixel representing that running figure, by reducing the information in the image. And so what comes to mind from that, or firstly, I would guess wrongly, as probably all of you know, is that there's not enough information in a single stream of data to actually have anything of real meaning. And I kind of took that as a challenge and spent a year creating a work about that, where the work is, let me show this first. So this is, this has a title near it that says "Walking Back and Forth." And the challenge I did for this work was to, it's called Last Day in the Beginning of March, and it's a poem about the last day of my brother's life. And it consists simply of these 25 circles of light projected onto the floor, each going at their own rhythm, and each with a little half a sentence of text next to them describing what it is that you're looking at. So I wanted to, it's essentially kind of a symphony in light when you walk into the space. But then when you start to look at, in detail, at each of the individual rhythms of light, they have meaning after you've read the kind of cues to kind of trigger you in. One of the things I noticed right away when I started doing this work was that I wasn't going to do it with sensors, because so many things that I wanted to capture, walking for example, weren't going to be very easy to do that way. So I ended up drawing graphs in time, kind of a more abstract way of defining these rhythms in light than trying to record them from, a person walking. How do you get a person walking, or how do you get the rhythm of windshield wipers? I mean, you could come up with many ways of doing them, but generally I would argue that there's no one way that would be better than actually just creating it in terms of getting a point across. So the work became fictional in terms of the rhythms that I used and how I created them. I'm very good with an oscilloscope, and so I kind of understand the relationship of time with graphs intuitively, just because it's what I did in my job for 25 years. So this is what the space looked like. It's kind of a rendering of the space with these 25 dynamically changing circles of light. And then each one had a little kind of title near it to describe what it is that you were looking at. And this is the work itself. This showed at the Berkeley Art Museum originally in 2003. So this is kind of extreme in terms of the direction that I've been heading of minimalization, trying to represent something in some sort of essential way. But not necessarily in this case by reducing kind of gathered information, more by creating it. This is a telephone ringing and then being answered and picked up. And if you actually stand in front of that and you know what it is, then it all kind of makes sense to you, hopefully. A few more works here, and then I'm done, and we can have hopefully more questions. For this series of photographic-based works, I was interested in taking time and compressing it, and trying to understand what would come out at the end. It was more of a exploration out of curiosity. So for this work, I took the entire film Psycho and compressed it into a single frame. And again, when I tell software people that I actually did this in hardware, they look at me like I'm completely nuts, and I probably was, but it's how I know how to do things. So I built this box. You plug video in, and it just accumulates and averages over and over and over again. It could, I think it would take 20 hours of information into it. So there's actually information left in the image. There's a lamp on the right-hand side, and that's because Hitchcock used very long shots, so they kind of get burned in at the end. You can actually, the first half hour of the movie is Janet Leigh driving kind of various shots from the front through the windshield, and you can actually see almost a skeletal look in the middle of this image with like two places where her eyes are from her moving. And again, this was done just because I was curious what, if anything would be there. And fortunately, the first thing I tried, there was something there, and the second one I tried, there wasn't, and that's The Wizard of Oz. There's nothing left comprehensible except for the sky. There were a lot of skies in the film. And then I did my own images through the same process and realized I was doing what the futurists were trying to do almost 100 years ago, which is to capture movement in a static frame of photograph, or mostly in their case painting and sculpture, but also photography. So I followed an automobile down a freeway for 2 minutes. It passed me during that time. So you're seeing it from the front, the side, and behind, all at the same time, which is exactly what, there's a famous painting called The Dynamism of an Automobile, and so I did kind of some of the same things that the futurists did. They didn't do a cow, but I did a cow. So one of the things I realized after I shot these is, okay, there's movement. I'm trying to capture movement, but a lot of the movement is mine. I mean, I'm pointing at these things, and I'm doing this. So I flipped it around, and I did two works called Dynamism of the Observer. In this case, I stood there for an hour. And so the hands are blurry because the clock's moving, but the clock is blurry because I'm moving. In this case, nothing is moving in the image except for me for an hour and a half. So I just kind of squatted next to the statue. So it's completely about my movement. And then two more pieces that deal with time. I wanted to build a clock that you didn't have to set. And so this is a very simple concept. If any of you know what a phase lock loop is, I simply put a light sensor outside that just measured light level in an area where there wasn't a lot of artificial light. And this work phases itself to the rhythms of the sun and tells you the percentage of the day gone based just on the light level measurement outside. So in this case, 29.5% of the day is gone. And it speeds up obviously more during the day in the summer. In the winter. It slows down in the summer. It has jet lag. If I take it to a new location, it takes 3 or 4 days to kind of find its rhythm. Again, just based on this, it's not a tracking sensor or anything. It's just a light level outside. And then taking that same information, I did another work where this woman gradually, she sits down at sunrise and she answers the phone at sunset. And based on that same information, so it takes her 12 hours on the typical day to walk from sitting down to, and that's what it looks like at noon. And then this last work is portrait of Harry Nyquist, who is an engineer that probably is why I do all these works, and engineer that I cursed at more in my job over the last 25 years, probably more than God. That's it. I'm done. Questions, please.
I have one about preservation that I imagine you get a bunch. You've got works in SF MoMA, permanent collection, and lots of places where we're hoping they'll be around for a good long while. But it seems like these are harder to keep running forever than paintings. How does that all work?
Completely differently with institution to institution, and also with artist to artist. The Met in New York, for example, asks for 2 copies. They just want to put a backup copy away. And they'll never lend it kind of separately from the other one unless the other one breaks, and then they'll have that backup copy. There's an organization that's called Dehn that's coming out of it's a collaboration between an institution in Montreal and the Guggenheim, and that's all they're focusing on is the preservation and creating kind of manuals for how to recreate kind of existing works, where, for example, in these cases, where the hardware, the physicality is important, but also in their case where it's software that no longer works with any computer that's out there, kind of thing. And I'm currently kind of working on manuals to ship with my works. And right now I send schematics sometimes and things like that, but that's pretty useless to most people. So it is kind of difficult, and basically one of the things I found out recently is that LED manufacturers have been lying, and I'm getting works back that I told they could leave on all the time in 2000 that are too dim to see. So I've started to use, for example, in my case, very high power LEDs, and I'm running them at about 5% of their rating so that they'll last a lot longer, which I've always done, 25 to 50%, but apparently that wasn't enough. Yes?
Do you think people have more appreciation for electronic art now that we are more aware of technology and electronics in general, or did it not make a difference, like you saw from 1990 to 2000?
Oh, completely different. Completely different. I mean,
is it better though? Like, do people, because now you look at image generation through computer software, and then you have Photoshop and stuff like that. Do people take electronic art for granted, or is it like, do you still, is there a distinction between what art was in 1990 and what it is today?
Well, there's a distinction for some people, and the distinctions are different. I mean, for a while, it was hard for many writers and curators, just because the vocabulary even is so different, and how do you talk about something? And Photoshop's a good example, because I think for a long time, you could take an image, put it in Photoshop, and press a button, and you would have, what some people might call a work of art who had never seen Photoshop before. So it certainly brought up and has brought up many kind of new issues. However, I think at least those issues will be gone in 10 years, because everyone will kind of have those references and those points of beginning. So we're still kind of in a transitional time, I think. But when I started doing this kind of work, there were not that many people doing this kind of work in the late 80s. And now there's probably literally 1,000 times more people doing the kind of work that I do in the art world, maybe 10,000 times more people. I mean, there were no departments dedicated to the work that I do, other than the media lab, but that really wasn't about art in any way at that time. And now, UCLA has probably 20 people in their new media department, so it's completely different. Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about your process? Like, for instance, do you ship the prototype, or when you're working, do you flip into design mode and then just plug?
Good question. I first ship the prototype. I make the prototype to see if it's an interesting idea. The LED boards are a good example because it took a long time to make that first one just because it had so many wires on it. And I did ship that one. I'm trying to trade them one of the kind of mass-produced ones and get it back because it's kind of more fun in a way. It's got the ICs on the front and it's a little more cyber looking. But these days, circuit boards, getting slightly specific, are fairly cheap to do, and so sometimes if I have an idea, I'll just get a circuit board made and hope that something comes of it, kind of thing. But I usually build the first of kind of anything I do, and then after that, if I feel like I'm going to do a number of them more, I'll make a circuit board and figure out a process for kind of, because I worked in Silicon Valley for 25 years, I have some connections down there in terms of board stuffers and board layout people and manufacturing and things. No, those were, each LED has a microprocessor. Each LED board has a microprocessor on it, a dollar pick. Yeah. The hard part on that one was getting them, because when I first did it, again, my background is FPGA. I work a lot with field programmable gate arrays versus microprocessors, and that was my first microprocessor project. So the challenge with that was, I originally, on the first prototype, as you were saying, I had little jumpers on but there's like 1,200 LEDs in some of those, and to like jumper those to figure out. So the challenge there was to come up with an automatic addressing scheme. So no matter how I put them together, they would figure out where they were. And once I did that, it became pretty straightforward. Yes?
Do you have a methodology for tracking down these really great materials? For example, the resin, or is it sort of like you have an idea of what you're looking for, or is there a process of experimentation?
It's kind of both. Sometimes the works are triggered by a new technology. Like when I first saw that liquid crystal display material that goes foggy and clear, it was magic to me, and I wanted to figure out, this kind of controlling perception that way. I wanted to figure out what to do with it. I'm changing that way a little bit. In the past, I tended to only use materials that I was comfortable with. Or could get comfortable with, but more recently, like the glass casting, for example, in some of the works, I've started working with other people and using them as vendors almost to create a work. So it's more about learning about what the limitations are for a certain technology like glass or resin or. Yes?
I was originally wondering if your pieces with the Buddha in it is referencing Namjoon Paik's work.
Good question.
And also, in relation to that, how you're introduced to the art world, and if you continue to stay an engineer and an artist, or looking at your artwork, your pieces evolve from one to another depending on the content, and it's so natural that one project led to the next, but it doesn't necessarily seem to be informed by new technology or what's going on in engineering. So could you talk generally?
Yeah, I started doing engineering in Silicon Valley in 1978, and I made films kind of simultaneous with that, films and videos, for 10 or 12 years. And then working in Silicon Valley for that whole time, maybe 3 or 4 days a week, and weekends and one extra day usually I would find time and make time for doing artwork, which in that case was more filmmaking. And then in the late 80s, I kind of, ended up combining my interest in image making with the only skill I really had, which was electrical engineering and image processing, and started doing this kind of work. And then gradually, since 1988, when I was working 4 days a week, till about a year ago, to 2 years ago when I was working 4 days a month, just to stay involved, just because I like engineering, and I actually miss it. I've been doing it for 30 years, and I just gave it up a year ago completely because I just didn't have enough time anymore, and I guess I'm a little more tired than I used to be. Yeah, I guess there was I couldn't do the work without thinking of Namjoon. I couldn't do the Buddha without thinking of Namjoon Paik. For that work, I didn't want to use the cliche kind of 60s, 70s Zen meets physics, Heisenberg, Buddha. I didn't want to do that, so I tried about 100 different objects in there, literally, and the Buddha worked the best, so I just stuck with it. So I knew about the Namjoon Paik, and I knew it would be a reference, and he certainly, that series of works of his are the favorite works of his that I've liked. The kind of self-reflecting video works.
So your work's pretty geeky in the sense that, the way it's made is pretty important. A monitor wouldn't work, and the breathing piece has a box that physically has the memory in it. In a lot of these things, it's not metaphorical. It's not like you took a PC and hooked it up. It's real custom hardware in any case. And I was just wondering if you could, I don't think I've been to an art talk before where phase lock loop came up. And so a lot of what's interesting about this is kind of the geekiness of it all. I was just wondering if you could talk about that.
Well, it's a good question. I don't see myself as a sculptor, for example, and there are a couple artists in my field. If you know Alan Rath, for example, who lives in Oakland, who does similar work as mine, but the presentation he's better at. So coming from filmmaking and photography, it's always been the image that interested in me, and certainly in the beginning, I would build cabinets to hide all of the technology, not because I wanted it to be magic, because it was kind of irrelevant to the image that I was trying to work with, or the mirrors in those cases. So I've gradually learned a little bit about sculpture, but I'm still clumsy kind of at it. So I always hide as much as I can but don't hide what needs to stay there to kind of make sense with the concept of what I'm doing. In the case of the memory works, it was very important to have the connection between this coffin of time or this memory connected to something, and to see those wires. Usually I hide the wires, and again, it's come out in the curtain pieces where the physical presentation of them becomes very important, because you're looking at it kind of just to see the image behind them. And I've been accused of those being too slick kind of thing, and so it's interesting because it usually is a goal to not have any physicality present, not find the power wire and place it a certain way kind of thing, just try to hide it kind of thing. Yes?
Going on about that and the idea you talked about earlier about these one-liners being formulaic, how do you view the sort of increasing availability and accessibility of a lot of these tools that, for example, like an LED array is now something you can order off the internet for like $15. How does that affect sort of the directions you want to take your work, and sort of the challenges you want to try and surmount when there's so many other people who could easily kind of get these tools and try and do kind of the same sort of stuff nowadays?
It's a very good question, and I don't know if I have the answer. I do think that it was very depressing when I showed the hallucination piece, the one with the fire that I did in 1990, and the electronics for that was essentially this big that I had built. It was like multiple circuit boards, and I used a 1 megahertz PC to control it. Could barely control it, let alone do it, kind of thing. And a student recently said, "Well, can't you do that with Macs and a portable Mac?" And yeah, you can, basically. And so it kind of made me realize that. I've always been aware that I'm lucky and I've been as successful as I am because I have the talent of being an engineer. And that allowed me to do things, among other things, that were impossible to do any other way. Now they're not. So, yeah, I'm not sure what else I can say other than that. It makes me think about things where that question is irrelevant, I guess. Doesn't mean successfully, but. Yeah.
With one-liners, looking at it. Comment about the audience. What have you come to in terms of when you're putting something like this together, how much do you consider the reality of something coming up to it? Maybe in contrast with like interactive science. Like the masters at the Exploratorium who have these really picky ones, and then the
right.
Decade sync right on it and this interaction, and then they go on.
Right. Well, I think one of the things that kind of has been getting better over time that in the beginning was very clumsy. One of the problems with interactive work in the beginning was that they were, it's kind of in a funny way, it's the Hollywood model of filmmaking in that you have to think about your audience and you have to think about their response. And what it creates is kind of a contrived result. And usually that's something that, as far as I'm concerned, is antithetical to what creating art is about. And it was one of the issues that I had with doing interactive work because I had to pre-guess my audience. I had to think about that. And it's not anything that I ever kind of came to terms with or figured out. But I think there are solutions. It's just I don't think we're there yet. And that's, I guess, one of the exciting things about what the person over there asked who's gone now about the change from 1990 to now is I do think there is finally, because there's so much energy being spent, there's finally progress being made in things that I didn't think there would never be any progress in the direction of. More intuitive interfaces, I guess.
The stained glass is didactic, but it's still beautiful.
Right. Well, but with regard to the diagram that I drew or whatever or the animation, that's kind of the catch-22 of it, is you could actually pick two of those just randomly, and almost regardless of how you would create that, it could be beautiful. So what does that mean? I think what it means probably is that the notion of beauty might change with regard to that kind of work and knowledge and understanding, but maybe not. Yes.
You talked to me a little bit about how with the candle you weren't sure that much of your audience connection between like sound and similarly with the pencil.
Yeah.
And I would imagine to a great extent probably the audience isn't always entirely aware of how in depth the custom hardware that you're building is. I think a lot of times when artists analyze the processes of art, so I'm wondering, do you think it's important for them to understand what went into that in order to create it, or is it really the just end experience of what it is that they're seeing or feeling that matters to you?
I think it's just an experience. I think it's important that works like that work on different levels. I mean, if I'm the only one who gets it, it's definitely a self-indulgent failure. So I used to use, when she was alive, my mother who kind of was not very educated and certainly not very educated in the world of art. And I would show her works and see if she felt anything or could connect to anything within it. And then maybe it would work on other levels also. But I think it's about working kind of being able to get deeper and deeper and deeper. So even though, for example, the Buddha piece, the piece with the Buddha in the cube, when I first showed that the second time in New York at the opening, was so crowded that it never cleared up. It was just completely foggy the whole time, and everyone thought that was the work. And I was fine with it. I mean, it was okay kind of thing. So, but it needed to work in that state. The shadow, kind of in a way, is what made it work. Otherwise, it would have been too conceptual for my taste if it were just a glowing cube kind of thing. One more minute, one more question. Come on, a really hard one? A really critical one, or a really...
What's next?
Working on a public artwork in New York at a large-scale outdoor park, inside a park, temporary, 6 month, where I'm taking, see if I can describe it in 1 minute, since you asked. Taking imagine a big grid of light bulbs, just like the LEDs, and then, so 12 feet by 16 feet, or actually this is going to be 16 feet by 40 feet, and putting an image on it. But then in the, I don't know what axis that would be, but in the axis of how it's viewed, pull each light bulb away from that kind of flat field of what the image is towards the viewer, at the moment, a random amount, so that this image exists in space. So if you saw it from infinity, you wouldn't be able to tell that was the case. It would just be this image created on these light bulbs. But the closer you get, you realize that it has dimension to it and this kind of random thing. Yeah, they're moving. The bulbs are not moving. The image is moving, kind of. So the image becomes it's another way of making the image three-dimensional kind of thing. I tested it in a gallery, my gallery that was closed for a week, and so I stole the space. And it worked pretty well, though I could only get about 10 feet away from it, so I had to simulate it with my Reconstruction filter. But it's pretty interesting. You could see this image, even though it was 10 feet deep and kind of randomly moving in terms of the pixels. Was that clear enough in terms of, okay, good. That's the end.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.